Audiobook of Contrasting Identities, Navigating Identity Politics Conversations, Chapter 2, The Authority of Acquainted Knowledge. Chapter 2, The Authority of Acquainted Knowledge. In this understanding of IP, the concept is heavily dependent upon the experiences from identity groups. This is where the argument from authority will come regarding group membership. An example of this is when you may hear someone say, "You don't know what we've been through," or "We know how it feels to go through this." Critical thinking usually advises against arguments based upon the person giving the argument, as opposed to focusing on the argument itself. And this is typically correct. Arguments based on the person are known as two kinds of fallacies: ad hominem and appealing to authority. Ad hominem is when someone will reject somebody's argument or will not be willing to listen to them based on something about that person. An example of this fallacy in use against IP would be, "What would you know? You're a white man. Check your privilege." On the other side of the coin, an appeal to authority is when someone will accept somebody's argument or be willing to listen more based on something about that person. Relevant to IP, such an example would be issues regarding Indigenous Australians being overseen by an Indigenous Australian. For instance, in Australia, there are certain jobs focused on engagement with Indigenous Australians where you must be an Indigenous Australian to apply for the job. Australian Human Rights Commission. Although appealing to authority is typically taught as a fallacy, it is not always. Appealing to authority is a legitimate argument when we do not have the means to get the knowledge ourselves and need to appeal to someone who does have that knowledge. For instance, I need to appeal to my doctor's authority on diagnosing my illness and prescribing treatment, because I can't spend 10 years gaining the same level of knowledge to diagnose and prescribe myself. There are other things to consider when appealing to authority, but for these purposes, I will focus mainly on the criterion that appealing to authority is legitimate when I cannot get the knowledge myself. In the cases where appealing to authority is legitimate, there are cases where ad hominem becomes legitimate as well. A case where ad hominem can be legitimate when they are not an expert in the area being discussed. For instance, if a climate scientist says that climate change is man-made, then we can accept what they say because we cannot do all the training and redo all the research to come to notice on our own. However, if an engineer says that climate change is not man-made and appeals to their own authority, we can dismiss what they say because their expertise is not relevant to that area. In general, if someone gives an argument when they are not appealing to authority and you can get the knowledge on the subject on your own, retorting that they are not an expert is an illegitimate ad hominem. As human beings, all of us do hold a kind of knowledge that only we have and nobody else can have. This knowledge is acquainted knowledge. Acquainted knowledge is gained through direct experience. This is contrasted with descriptive knowledge, which is knowing things about a particular topic without necessarily experiencing it ourselves. This kind of knowledge came about from Frank Jackson's thought experiment called Mary's Room. Imagine that Mary has lived her entire life in a black and white room, but has been educated on all the physical facts there is to know about how people see colour. However, Mary leaves the black and white room and observes the colour red for the first time. C. Daly, 2010, says that what is usually argued is that upon experiencing the colour red, Mary has learnt something new, even though she knew all the physical facts about people observing colour. Therefore, there must be something non-physical about this new knowledge. Frank Jackson himself has conceded that this thought experiment fails to establish that there is something non-physical about the mind, because the new knowledge obtained by Mary can be explained as knowledge acquainted by direct observation of the colour red, which is a cognitive event that is compatible with physicalism. Physicalism is the view that everything about the mind is physical, and there is nothing that there is non-physical. See Daly, 2010. Although Mary's room thought experiment fails in its argument for non-physical parts of the mind, there is something we have learned from that thought experiment. That knowing what it is like to experience something can only be achieved through direct experience. This is because there is knowledge that can only be known by Mary, which is that only she can know what it is like for her to experience red for the first time. We can make assumptions that if Mary was not colorblind and had 20/20 vision, then we can reasonably assume the visual experience would have been similar to our own. However, we would not know what it would be like to live our lives in a black and white room and suddenly see red for the first time. Would we find it beautiful or ugly? Would we be excited or frightened? We could try to imagine what it would be like, and our imagination may be correct. However, we would not thereby know what it would be like. The only person who can know this is Mary. From this, we can conclude that knowing what it is like to experience something is something only we can know. For others to even be able to imagine what it is like is to have us tell them. This makes us the authority. However, this only makes us the authority on acquainted knowledge, not descriptive knowledge. One might read this and object that this is evidence for seeing us as individuals, because even amongst groups, each individual person amongst the group will have their own acquainted knowledge the other members will not have. And this is true, a point that will be explored in more depth when discussing intersectionality. However, our ability to imagine other people's experiences will change in degree based on how similar our experiences have been. For instance, consider the worst possible experience, losing a child. A mother who has not lost a child would feel great sympathy for the mother who did lose a child, but would never feel entitled to say, "I understand how you feel." Indeed, if she did say that she understands how the bereaved mother feels, the reaction would be a furious, "No, you don't." Whereas, if a mother who had experienced the loss of a child would not be met with the same reaction. This is due to that both women, although would have experiences special only to them, do possess the shared experience of the loss of a child. Hence, they would have an easier time understanding each other's grief as opposed to someone who has not. So, our ability to understand other people's situations comes in degrees which are influenced by the kinds of experiences we have had. A person who has lived their life in a black and white room and seen red for the first time will have a better idea of how Mary would be feeling than someone who has not. This is where the shared experiences of group identity come into play. If you're a man, a woman, or non-binary, you will have a better understanding of what it is like to experience the world from that standpoint than someone who does not share that gender identity. People will behave around you and speak to you differently based on these facts about you, and you will also behave differently to those who are around you. This is due to the gender roles we associate with one another. If you are of an upper, middle, or lower economic class, then you'll have different opportunities, different social circles, and live in different areas, and so on. If you are of a different race, this will have an impact on how the world sees you and how you see the world. In any country where the majority are one kind of skin color and you are of the minority, you'll be noticed more than those of the majority. From this, you too will also notice your difference from the majority, which will impact on your view on the world. Imagine a world where 90% of the inhabitants had red hair and only 10% had brown hair. If you had red hair, coming across someone with brown hair would invite a reaction of curiosity, and if you had brown hair, you would notice the curiosity experienced by those with red hair. Thus, being of a certain gender, race, and economic class will give you a better understanding of how the world looks from that perspective, in contrast to those who do not share those attributes. So, there is a shared acquainted knowledge these groups possess. which someone outside these groups cannot. However, even within these groups, there will be nuanced differences, which I'll cover in the next chapter.